Today, why home prices must fall. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. The other day, there was a very important article in the Australian Financial Review. And I've been meaning to bring this to your attention, but it's been so busy with so many other things going on. But today, let me just walk you through some of the key points that they made and discuss the consequences of them. It started out by saying that the former Bank of Australia Governor Ian Macfarlane says house prices must fall to help solve growing wealth inequality for younger Australians, amid warnings that Labor's home equity scheme could drive up prices. Mr Macfarlane, appointed Deputy Governor of the RBA by the Keating government back in 1992 and Governor by the Howard government in 1996, refused to comment directly on Tuesday's interest rate decision, but has previously warned that cutting rates to near zero had not done any good. He also avoided commenting directly on Labor's Help to Buy scheme of contributing as much as 40% of the purchase price of a new home for more than 10,000 Australians, but appeared to suggest it was not the solution. You actually have to have probably a fall in house prices. That's not going to be very popular, but that's probably essential to any solution, he told the Actuaries Institute's annual summit last week in Melbourne. Grattan Institute Chief Executive Danielle Wood told the same panel that Labor's proposal was only part of the solution, and Grattan made a similar shared equity proposal earlier this year, but conceded it might moderately push up prices. The question of supply is important. Tax breaks we've talked about, which encourage investors to come into the market, Ms Wood said. We're seeing more schemes, such as the one announced by Labor, which help first home buyers in, but ultimately you have to do all of those things to have a chance of shifting the dial. Mr Macfarlane said young Australians should be squealing louder as wealth inequality grows despite near-zero interest rates and record-high fiscal stimulus. And he pointed to renewed debate in the United States over the concept of secular stagnation, little or no growth, to cite the most expansionary monetary and fiscal policy in US history, which he attributed to increasing wealth inequality. If most of the increases in national income fall into the hands of the already rich, which is indeed what has happened, it's easy to see why it won't lead to strong growth in consumption. Australia's reliance on income tax was making wealth inequality worse, he said. Australians pay more personal income tax as a share of government revenue than any other advanced economy, except for the high-taxing Scandinavian state of Denmark, according to data from the OECD. Personal income tax revenue rose to 42% of total tax collected by federal and state governments in 2019. That's nearly twice as much as the OECD average of 23.5%, which Mr Macfarlane warned was disproportionately hurting younger working Australians. I'm surprised that it's not a bigger issue, he said. The people who hold all the wealth are the older people. We don't really tax wealth. The people who depend on income are the young people who have no wealth, and our tax system relies very largely on taxing income, so we have a problem going forward. I'm surprised that the younger generation aren't actually squealing louder. Mr Macfarlane, also a former director of Woolworths, Leighton Holdings and ANZ, pointed to house prices going through the roof as the major driver of intergenerational wealth inequality, and said it was going to be very difficult to resolve. It's always been an attractive proposition to buy your own home, but we also designed the tax system to increase how attractive it could be, and so that's what's driving house prices through the roof. This has made this intergenerational inequality of wealth much bigger, he said. But he also blamed voters for failing to support governments in making tough reform. Governments respond to what voters want them to do, he said. At the moment, voters, by and large, are terrified with someone coming up with a policy that will hurt part of the economy, part of the population. And talking about taxation, there's no way a political party is going to put that forward because it will guarantee they won't get elected. Miss Wood, however, called it a failure of government. It's very difficult to have conversations about taxation of wealth, but certainly we have argued we should be looking at things like the rate of the capital gains discount, she said. We probably should have a conversation about inheritance taxes, dare I say it. But this explosion of wealth that we've seen over the last 30 years is largely in the hands of older Australians. We know that they won't spend it down. It will be passed on in future decades. And I fear that we are moving to a world with greater wealth inequality, where who our parents are will have a greater impact on your life than your own talents and hard work. Yeah, some very important points there. And let me just underscore a few things. The first is, if you look at the tax take now compared with, say, 20 or 30 years ago, more and more of it is coming from personal taxation rather than corporate taxation. That needs to be reversed. There are many corporates not paying their fair share, whereas many households are paying too much. The second point is that if you look at the trends in terms of lending over the last 20 to 30 years, more and more lending has gone to support home buying purchases through mortgages, while less and less, by way of proportion, are supporting business investment and business growth. In fact, it's a 2-to-1 ratio in favour of mortgages, where if you go back 30 years, it was 2-to-1 in favour of business. This is one reason why growth in Australia and economic momentum is so slow. Investing more and more into homes through bigger mortgages simply pumps up prices, but it does nothing to generate real value in the real economy. The third point is that the intergenerational shifts that we're talking about comes through in spades if you look at things like the bank of mum and dad. I've made several shows about this in recent times, because the more that the bank of mum and dad lends intergenerationally down to their kids, the more they are able to get into the market. But if you're not fortunate enough to have the right sort of parents with the right sort of equity in their property, then you can't get in. And I think the other point is this issue of inequality is one that nobody really wants to talk about. I noticed, for example, that through the election campaign, there's hardly any reference to it, just as there is to the very large proportion of people in rental accommodation and who really have very little hope, because, of course, as they move into retirement, their income gets crushed, but they still have to pay more for their rents. This is an unsustainable situation that we're in. But it comes back to a series of political decisions. And as McFarlane says, nobody really wants to take the hard decisions because nobody wants to see home prices drop on their watch. But the bottom line is this: given the high home prices relative to income and relative to GDP, in fact, relative to any measure you want to use, the only way to solve this problem is to allow home prices to come back to more normal levels. And that means a destruction of paper value. But of course, the benefits of doing this could certainly far outweigh the risks and the pain. After all, it's only paper profit. And there are some parties like the TNL who do have valid policies in this arena. It's just a pity it's not mainstream, and it's a pity it's not being discussed as it should be being discussed, either by the media or indeed by the main parties. So McFarlane is right. Unless things change, the inequality will get worse, house prices will continue to bubble higher, and that will just change the dynamic, intergenerationally speaking, to a more adverse state. And ultimately, that could lead to even intergenerational conflict if we're not careful. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.